All right, ladies and gentlemen, today we are going to look at the principles of the United States Constitution. This is something that will come up many times throughout our course this year. The first thing I want to do is explain to you quickly what do we mean by principles. Now, when we talk about principles as we spell it here, P-L-E-S, we are talking about rules that guide our beliefs and actions. And it's important to know that the U.S. government follows 8 important constitutional principles. The first one is called popular sovereignty. Number 2 is federalism. Number 3, rule of law. Number 4, separation of powers. Number 5, checks and balances. Number 6, judicial review. Number 7, limited government. And finally, number 8, due process of law. You probably recognize some of these because, yes, we have seen some of these before. It is really important to understand that when the government is making decisions, they are supposed to follow these principles. Let's start with popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty means people are the source of government's power. When we look at the word popular, popular refers to people, sovereignty refers to power or controller. So when you put it together, people, power. Let's take a look at some examples of popular sovereignty. The first type here is you have a lady voting, and that's because when you vote, you are deciding who should be part of the government, or if it's a referendum, you are deciding if a bill should become law. And another example of popular sovereignty is when people have peaceful demonstrations, as demonstrated in this photo, where you see people picketing and protesting outside of this building. Do you recognize that building? Yes, it is. That is the White House. Popular sovereignty. We are now going to look at the concept of federalism. Federalism is something you've seen before. Here is the definition. Power is divided and shared between the national, state, and sometimes the local governments. A really good quote to remember, to help you remember what federalism means, is when you have local problems, you're going to need local solutions. When you have national problems, you're going to need national solutions. And so if you take a look here, you see some really good examples of federalism. You'll notice how there are national powers over here, like declaring war, issuing money, but then you see on the other side, you see these reserved powers, and these are powers that are that are for the states only, regulating education, granting licenses, like marriage licenses, things like that. And then in the middle here, you see this concept called concurrent powers. Now, concurrent means something like shared. So, for example, when we're making a constitutional amendment, you have the national government proposing, you have the states that have the responsibility of ratification, as well as each level of government does levy taxes or put taxes on their citizens, and they have courts, they define crimes, etc. The third principle we're looking at is called rule of law. And under rule of law, the idea here is quite simple. Laws apply to all people. Oftentimes, you might see this phrase, no one is above the law. What that means is, no matter how much money, no matter how much power you have, you, me, everybody are supposed to obey the law. And if we don't obey the law, we can face punishment. For example here you have President Obama in a poster, and this person wants to impeach him. So impeachment is an example of how if the president does something illegal, the House of Representatives can vote to impeach him, and in some cases the Senate would conduct the trial and determine if the president or other federal official would be kicked out. The next principle is called separation of powers, and I know you've seen this before. And the idea here is quite simple. Instead of having one king or dictator that has every single power, in separation of powers, the government power is divided between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. So here you go. You have the legislative branch that makes laws. Here's the U.S. Capitol. Who works in the U.S. Capitol? Congress. You have the executive branch that enforces laws. Which part of our government lives in the White House? That's right, the president. And then you have the judicial branch. And what part of our national government represents the judicial branch that interprets laws? Yep, the Supreme Court. This is a little visual image I use every year with my students to help them remember the idea of separation of powers. It's kind of like we have three branches of our government that separate our government. It's kind of like having a three-headed monster. You'll notice the body is something that each head or each branch shares, but each head looks different, acts different, has different powers, different duties, different responsibilities. Next, you have checks and balances. Checks and balances is similar to separation of powers because here you have each of the three branches, but what makes this different, checks and balances is referring to how each branch can limit or check or monitor the actions of the other branch. For example, let's say Congress creates a law. Well, if the president doesn't like it, he can veto the law, which means reject it. However, if enough members of Congress really want this law to actually exist, they can override a veto if 2/3 of both the House and the Senate agree. Well, let's say someone challenges the law. They think it's unfair. At the end of the day, the Supreme Court and the judicial branch has the ability to declare the law unconstitutional. So here you have Congress making laws, the president has the ability to sign or veto laws, and sometimes the Supreme Court can declare if the law is constitutional or if it needs to be knocked away if it's unconstitutional. That is checks and balances. Judicial review. So here you have judicial review. Judicial review is a specific example of checks and balances, and this is something you will definitely see on the government HSA. Under judicial review, the courts, specifically the Supreme Court, can decide if a government action or law violates the Constitution. Something you have to know that's of real importance is a very famous court case called Marbury versus Madison. This is something we'll study more in depth later in the year. This is a court case that actually created this power, judicial review. When the U.S. Constitution was originally created, the framers didn't really write too much describing the powers of the Supreme Court. So in 1803, Justice John Marshall, he created this power, sort of, that gives the Supreme Court so much power. And if you take a look at this political cartoon here, you can see how the Supreme Court is really tall, while the other two branches are really small. Think about the use of size in this political cartoon. Remember, nothing is done by accident. Yep, because the Supreme Court here is so big, the cartoonist is emphasizing, to his or her point of view, that judicial review gives the Supreme Court a little bit more power than the other branches. And you have seen this one before, I promise. Here we have limited government. The idea of a limited government is that the government has limits, it has restrictions in order to protect a person's liberty. The government cannot do whatever it wants. Here you have an image of a police officer coming in to search a house, and right here he is showing the people a warrant. And a warrant is a legal document approved by a judge that allows the government to either search a specific property item, or in some cases take a property, or in some cases arrest someone if there is enough evidence to do so. Remember, the government can't just come into your house, take whatever it wants, eat a turkey sandwich. It has to have a warrant. Well, they can't have a warrant to eat a turkey sandwich. And then the last principle you should be familiar with is, in my opinion, the most important: due process of law. And here the definition is: the government must provide people with certain rights if they are accused of committing a crime. And so this specifically is called procedural due process, but I'm not too just focus on the words due process. Here are some examples, and this is just a short list. If you are arrested or accused of a crime, the Sixth Amendment guarantees you a right to a lawyer or some type of legal assistance. If you are arrested or accused of a crime, you have a right to a fair trial. If you are arrested or accused of a crime, you have a right to remain silent. You do not have to answer questions that could possibly incriminate yourself. That is called pleading the Fifth. And the last example here shows a person cannot receive cruel or unusual punishment, and that comes from the Eighth Amendment. And here you have a cartoon where the cartoonist is poking fun at how the government has not charged this person with a crime, and he is representing a Guantanamo detainee, an accused terrorist sitting in a prison in Guantanamo Bay. Can the government put someone in jail, keep them in jail, and not tell them and not charge them with a crime? Here are some questions, some controversies regarding due process. I hope this short little video helps you understand the meaning of each of these principles, and I urge you to watch it again and to go back to the specific principles that you still might need some help with and watch those clips again. Have a great day.